Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to engage in a critical exercise in strategic foresight. We are going to explore a scenario that, while hypothetical, sits at the volatile intersection of military escalation, energy security, and digital vulnerability. It is a scenario that has haunted defense planners and energy traders for decades. A major military confrontation between the United States and Iran that leads Tehran to follow through on its long-standing threat to close the Strait of Hormuz. To the casual observer, this might sound like a regional issue, a spike in oil prices, a news cycle dominated by tanker traffic and aircraft carriers. But to those of us who study the intricate latticework of our globalized existence, we recognize it as something far more profound. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz would not merely be a geopolitical event. It would be a systemic shock to the interconnected systems that underpin modern civilization. It would be a blow struck not just at the flow of oil, but at the very arteries of global communication and the lifeblood of the digital age. Today, we will dissect this potential catastrophe across four primary vectors. First, we will analyze the immediate and devastating disruption to the global oil and gas trade, mapping its impact from the supertankers to the gas stations of the world, with a specific focus on the energy-hungry behemoths of Asia. Second, we will trace a less obvious but equally critical pathway: how a disruption in liquefied natural gas, LNG, supply cascades into a crisis for global electricity production, and crucially, how this imperils the multi-trillion-dollar race for artificial intelligence supremacy. Third, we will unveil a profoundly overlooked risk: the Strait's role as a critical corridor for the world's undersea fiber optic cables, the physical infrastructure that carries 95% of global internet traffic. Finally, we will explore the evolution of warfare itself, examining a state like Iran, faced with conventional military inferiority, might weaponize the digital and information domains, turning the Strait into a chokehold not just on energy, but on data itself. We will then tie this all together by examining the secondary and tertiary market shocks, the specter of oil prices breaching $100, and the paradoxical nature of war as both a destroyer and, historically, a perverse economic stimulant in specific sectors. Buckle in. This is an exploration of our fragile world. Let us begin with the most visceral and well-understood aspect of this crisis: the energy trade. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow waterway, it is the world's most significant oil choke point. To understand importance, we must look at the numbers. At its narrowest point, the strait is just 21 nautical miles wide, but the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in each direction. Through this slender channel flows between 20% and 30% of the world's crude oil, and a significant portion of its LNG. We are talking about roughly 21 million barrels of oil per day. To put that in perspective, that is more than the entire daily consumption of China, the world's largest importer. The immediate impact of a closure, whether through mines, military action, or sabotage, be the instantaneous removal of this supply from the global market. This is not a gradual taper, it is a sudden amputation. The primary victims of this amputation would be in Asia. While the West often frames Middle East tensions through the lens of gasoline prices in the US or diesel in Europe, the reality is that the lion's share of this oil, approximately 80 to 90% of the crude, exported through the Strait, heads to Asian markets. The major customers are China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other emerging economies in Southeast Asia. China, as the world's largest oil importer and a massive consumer of Middle Eastern crude, would face an existential energy crunch. Its strategic petroleum reserves, while substantial, are a buffer, not a long-term solution. A prolonged closure would force Beijing into a desperate scramble for spot cargoes from the Atlantic Basin, U.S. shale, West African, and North Sea crude, sending freight rates into the stratosphere and bidding wars erupting between nations. This would fundamentally alter the geopolitical balance, pitting allies against each other in a brutal competition for dwindling resources. India, similarly, relies on the Strait for a vast majority of its imports. Its growing economy, its burgeoning middle class, and its ambitious infrastructure plans are all predicated on affordable and accessible energy. A price shock of this magnitude would be economically devastating, potentially stoking inflation, widening its trade deficit, and causing significant social unrest. Japan and South Korea, as mature, technologically advanced economies with few domestic energy resources, are even more vulnerable. For them, energy security is synonymous with national security. A closure would threaten their very industrial base, forcing them to make impossible choices about rationing and economic slowdown. The U.S. alliance system would be tested to its breaking point as Washington would be unable to protect its allies from this economic strangulation. The closure would not just be about oil. It is about natural gas liquids and LNG. Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, shares this massive gas field with Iran and ships nearly all its product through the Strait. A disruption here would send shockwaves through global gas markets, which are already tighter and more regionally fragmented than oil markets. European nations, having weaned themselves off Russian pipeline gas, are heavily reliant on global LNG. They would find themselves in a bidding war with Asia for every available cargo, driving prices to unprecedented heights. This brings us to our second, more nuanced point: the connection between the Strait of Hormuz, electricity, and the global race for artificial intelligence. We can speak of AI in abstract, ethereal terms: algorithms, neural networks, large language models. But AI is intensely physical. It is not magic. It is math, and math requires massive amounts of electricity. The world's largest tech companies, the hyperscale data center operators like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta, are in an arms race to build the most powerful AI models. This race is predicated on two things: access to cutting-edge semiconductors like NVIDIA's H100 GPUs, and just as importantly, access to cheap, reliable, and massive amounts of power. A single query to an AI model like GPT-4 can consume times the electricity of a standard Google search. Training a frontier AI model consumes as much electricity as thousands of homes do in a year. Data centers are becoming power-hungry monsters, and their growth trajectory is exponential. Now, how does this connect to the Strait of Hormuz? Through natural gas. Natural gas is the backbone of reliable electricity generation in much of the world. It is the bridge fuel that provides the baseload and peaking power necessary to keep modern grids stable, especially as intermittent renewables like solar and wind are added to the mix. When LNG supply from the Gulf is choked off, global gas prices soar. This has a direct and immediate impact on electricity prices. In Europe, which relies on gas-fired power plants for a significant portion of its grid, electricity costs would skyrocket. In parts of Asia, where gas is also a key fuel source, the same would occur. What happens when electricity becomes prohibitively expensive? Everything becomes more expensive, but the blow to the tech sector would be profound. The operating costs for data centers would explode. The economic viability of training massive new AI models would be called into question. The pace of innovation, which is currently measured in months, could slow to a crawl. The companies that are best positioned to weather this storm would be those with dedicated, contracted power sources, or those located in regions with regulated utilities or abundant domestic energy. This is not merely an economic inconvenience. We are talking about a potential derailment of the next technological revolution. The nation or bloc that can secure affordable energy for its digital infrastructure will win the AI race. A crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, therefore, becomes a crisis in Silicon Valley, in Shenzhen, in Seoul, and in every tech hub in between. It would transform the AI arms race from a contest of pure ingenuity into a contest of raw resource security. The lights of the digital age literally depend on the safe passage of molecules through a narrow, volatile stretch of water. If the potential impact on AI is a more complex layer of the energy crisis, the threat to undersea optic cables is a parallel crisis that is almost entirely absent from mainstream strategic discussion. We tend to think of the internet as a cloud, something wireless and ethereal. This is a dangerous misconception. The internet is a physical place. It is a network of millions of miles of cables lying on the ocean floor, and a shocking number of them run through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. We often hear that 95% of intercontinental internet traffic is carried by undersea cables. What is less known is that the Middle East, and specifically the Persian Gulf, is a major nexus for this infrastructure. Cables connecting Europe to Asia, Africa to the Middle East all converge in this region. Major cable systems like the Falcon, the SE8, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Western Europe family of cables, and numerous others pass through or land in the Gulf states. Why is this significant? Because a state actor with the capability and intent could disrupt these cables with relative ease. We have seen a preview of this vulnerability. In early 2024, multiple cables in the Red Sea were cut, causing significant internet disruptions and rerouting for providers in the region. While the cause was initially murky, the incident highlighted the extreme fragility of this infrastructure to accidents, anchor drags, or, most alarmingly, deliberate sabotage. In our hypothetical scenario, following a U.S. attack, Iran could expand its confrontation beyond the physical strait. It could target the digital strait. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy IRGC operates fast boats and has divers and small submarines. The depth of the strait is not prohibitive for sabotage operations. Imagine the scenario. Oil tankers are blocked, global oil markets are in turmoil. Then, simultaneously, major data cables are severed. The impact would be cascading and catastrophic. Global internet traffic would be instantly rerouted through remaining cables, causing massive congestion and latency. For nations heavily reliant on those specific cables, particularly in the Gulf region itself, but also in parts of East Africa and South Asia, the internet could slow to a crawl or go dark entirely. This would cripple the financial sector, which relies on high-speed, low-latency connections for high-frequency trading. It would paralyze global cloud services. A company in Europe trying to access data stored on a server in Singapore might find the connection hopelessly slow or broken. Global commerce that depends on just-in-time supply chains, which are coordinated through digital networks, would face immediate disruption. Telemedicine, remote education, and communication for millions of people would be severed. Iran would be demonstrating a terrifying new form of asymmetric warfare, the ability to hold the world's digital infrastructure hostage. It would be a clear message that in the modern era, geography still matters, and that the global economy's reliance on these thin strands of glass on the ocean floor is its greatest strategic vulnerability. The blockade of Hormuz would no longer be just about energy. It would be a blockade on data itself. This leads us to our final and most encompassing point. Iran has a long and proven history of using its digital capabilities as a weapon. We must view a potential closure of the strait not as a single, conventional military action, but as the opening salvo in a multi-domain campaign. The Iranian government has demonstrated its willingness and ability to control its domestic information space. We've witnessed this repeatedly during periods of civil unrest, most notably in 2019 and 2022, when the government effectively shut down the national internet to quell protests. This action, while domestic, showcased a deep understanding of information as a strategic asset. It showed they understand that to control the population, you must control the digital pipes. Now, project that capability outward. In the aftermath of a U.S. attack, Iran would not limit itself to the physical and digital choke points we've discussed. It would almost certainly unleash a significant and sustained cyber campaign. This is not speculation, it is pattern recognition. Iran has been accused of devastating cyber attacks in the past, from the Shamoon attacks that wiped the hard drives of Saudi oil companies to distributed denial of service. DOS, attacks on U.S. financial institutions. The targets would be vast and strategic. We would see attempts to disrupt the Saudi Aramco facilities again, targeting not just production but the industrial control systems. We would see attacks on the desalination plants that provide drinking water for millions across the Gulf, creating a humanitarian and environmental catastrophe. We would see relentless cyber intrusions aimed at the global energy trading platforms, attempting to manipulate markets or sow chaos. This is the evolution of modern warfare. The domains of conflict are no longer just land, air, and sea. We now must consider space, the information environment, and cyberspace as primary theaters of operation. Iran, facing the most powerful conventional military in human history, would seek to bypass it entirely. They would attack the global systems that the United States and its allies are built upon: the financial system, the energy grid, the digital networks. The closure of the Strait would be the main event, the visible crisis. But the invisible war, the cyber war, would be fought simultaneously and with potentially longer-lasting consequences. It would be a war of disruption, a war of exhaustion, a war designed to prove that there is no sanctuary, that the globalized systems we take for granted are fragile and can be broken. Let us now turn to the economic consequences that will ripple out from these interconnected shocks. The immediate and obvious impact is the price of oil. A closure would likely send Brent crude soaring past $100 a barrel, and depending on the perceived duration of the crisis, it could easily $150, $200, or even higher. We would see price discovery become chaotic and speculative. $100 oil is not just a number. It is a tax on global consumption. For the United States, it would mean a sharp rise in gasoline prices, feeding inflation and potentially tipping the economy into a recession. For Europe, already struggling with energy costs, it would be a body blow. For emerging markets like India and Turkey, which are highly sensitive to energy prices, it could trigger currency crises and social instability. Global trade, which relies on affordable maritime freight, would see its costs skyrocket, further constricting supply chains that are only just recovering from the pandemic era. There is a historical paradox worth noting here. In the very short term, wars and geopolitical shocks are terrible for risk assets. Stock markets plunge as investors flee to safety: the US dollar, gold, Swiss francs. This initial shock is one of fear and uncertainty. However, as the brilliant economic historian and strategist have noted, major conflicts often, after that initial shock, become a growth-driving phenomenon. How? Through massive state-led spending. A protracted crisis in the Gulf would trigger a monumental surge in military spending by the US, its regional allies, the GCC states, and potentially even Asian importers seeking to secure their own supply lines. We would see a massive reinvestment in naval assets, in cybersecurity, in domestic energy infrastructure. The U.S. defense budget, already enormous, would grow further. Countries would pour money into strategic petroleum reserves, into alternative energy sources, and into shoring up their digital defenses. This spending, while a response to destruction and disruption, injects capital into the economy. It creates jobs in defense manufacturing, in construction, for new pipelines or alternative energy infrastructure, and in technology. It becomes a form of fiscal stimulus. We saw elements of this during the Cold War, where the military-industrial complex was a significant driver of technological innovation and economic growth. A prolonged crisis in the Strait could, perversely, ignite a new era of investment in energy independence, in digital resilience, and in military technology. But we must be clear, this is not a desirable form of growth. It is growth born of fear and necessity, not of genuine prosperity. It diverts resources from social programs, from education, from healthcare. It hardens borders, both physical and digital. It creates a world that is more security-obsessed, more fragmented, and ultimately, less free. In conclusion, the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz after a U.S. attack is far more than a regional conflict or an oil shock. It is a stark, clarifying lens through which we can view the profound vulnerabilities of our hyper-connected world. It reveals that our energy security, our technological ambitions, like AI, our global communications, and our financial stability are all tethered to a few narrow stretches of water. and a few thin strands of glass on the ocean floor. We have moved from a bipolar Cold War world to a unipolar moment, and now to a multipolar, deeply interconnected, and fragile system. The actors in this system, like Iran, may not be able to win a conventional war, but they have studied our vulnerabilities and possess a growing toolkit from fast boats to cyberbugs to fiber optic cutters to impose immense costs. The closure of the Strait would trigger a cascade of crises: an energy famine in Asia, a power crisis that stalls the AI revolution, a digital dark age for regions dependent on cut cables, and a relentless, invisible cyber war targeting the very fabric of our economies. The price of oil would become a weapon of mass economic disruption, and the ensuing chaos could paradoxically fuel a new security-driven wave of global spending. The lesson of this exercise is not one of fear, but of understanding. We must broaden our definition of national security. It is not just about aircraft carriers and missile defense. It is about the resilience of our energy grids. It is about the redundancy of our digital infrastructure. It is about the security of the undersea cables that connect us. It is about understanding that in the 21st century, a narrow strait on the other side of the world is not a distant problem, but a potential circuit breaker for the entire global system. The Strait of Hormuz is a mirror, reflecting our own intricate dependencies and the uncomfortable truth that in our quest to connect the world, we may have created more ways for it to be pulled apart. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and share this video.